This is the fourth video in my series on outgrowing outworn worldviews. The previous video talked about materialism, which people within that worldview often refer to as scientific. Video before that talked about patriarchal religion as a worldview. This time, we're going to talk about a worldview that's been called different things. New Age is one, new spirituality, alternative spirituality. By its detractors, it sometimes has been called mixed spirituality. So let's get into that a little bit. This worldview, in some ways, has been offered as an alternative to the previous two that I just mentioned. So people don't like traditional religion and what it's become, and they turn to science and they see a universe with no soul, no purpose, no nothing. So in some ways, New Age, I'll just use that term, becomes their alternative. It also aligns itself often with people who identify as heathen, pagan, people in the goddess movements, and it emphasizes experiential spirituality, what you can actually feel and see, rather than doctrine or dogma. So there's a lot to recommend it. It also has some big shadows. And because we're talking about outworn worldviews, I want to spend some time on that. So, for one thing, people in this worldview often borrow scientific language that they then don't use accurately, because many of them don't have a scientific education of any significant kind. So some of the language is about energies and frequencies and vibrations, and more conscious practitioners hold those as metaphors. Some, on the other hand, take these as quite literal. And of course, they're borrowings from 19th century science. They're not up to date. And in terms of literalism, I want to give a couple of examples of that. So there are groups of people who point to, for instance, ancient pagan traditions because they want a tradition to be at home in. It's understandable. But when you look at actual anthropology, and deep time studies of the rituals and the parts that they say are, these are pagan, these are, and all that. You don't find them, or they're in fragments because, for instance, particularly in Europe, but also in the States, it's popular to be a druid in some ways, but Christian missionaries destroyed almost all of that many centuries ago. So it's problematic how much of this is creatively elaborated and how much is actually part of the tradition. So it might be good to say that, to actually be upfront about that. My dreaming into this includes these elements and so on. Instead, there's a more authority-based appeal. This is what the ancient wisdom masters taught, right? That kind of thing. The same thing with chakras and Akashic records and so on. Some of this language comes from theosophy, not chakras. That does come from ancient India. I think 6th century is when it was written about first. Seems to have been intended as a kind of teaching diagram for yoga or a symbol system, but under theosophy, and particularly a guy named Leadbeater, all of this in the late 1800s becomes literal energy centers, right? Same thing with the Akashic records. There's a record of wisdom that transcends lifetimes and so on and so forth. There are echoes of this in different religions, but a lot of this comes from not just theosophy, but Helena Blavatsky in particular read science fiction. Bulwer Lytton, for instance, who has the questionable fame of starting something with "It was a dark and stormy night." He's the guy that comes from. So she took lots of ideas from him and gave them this, what she thought was kind of Hindu sounding language, and then taught that as spiritual doctrine. So she drug everything else in, and so have people ever after, Atlantis and all the rest of it. So that's one of the influences. Another one is New Thought, which starts just a little bit earlier in the United States. And a key idea of New Thought is that our thoughts create reality. So that's where some of this comes from too. And it's all, as I said, it's often taken very literal mindedly. So you've probably heard of The Secret and manifesting and stuff like that, right? So, which is not to say that there isn't power in intentionality, but some of this can degenerate into just my ego wants something, and if I try hard enough, I'll get it, which is just American business written in spiritual terms, right? So with this, there's often an overemphasis on the bright, the spiritual, the inspirational, things like that, with a lot of neglect of shadow work. And so all of our darkness gets projected onto other people who are then accused of putting out negative vibes or not being evolved or things like that, right? Or in some cases, like if somebody has cancer, for instance, they must have manifested that for some higher purpose, which, there's complex psychological and physical and even spiritual dynamics involved when bad things happen to people. But the very act of saying that is an accusation. It's victim blaming, right? So that's one of the shadows. There's also a $1 billion industry in selling new age wellness products. These social media platforms are full of snake oil salespeople using pseudoscientific language to back up their claims. And they seem, plus a lot of people who are just passing on what they've heard from others, with no ill intent, but not looking into it either. There seems to be a reluctance to just let experience, spiritual otherwise, stand on its own terms and use descriptive language for it. There's a lot of borrowing from science to make it seem authoritative. Quantum science says this, and no, it doesn't. If you have a basic scientific education, you see through a lot of this pretty quickly. The so-called observer effect is not how people describe it, and so on. And there's actually been lots of scientists debunking some of this stuff. So one thing I'll mention too is there's a lack of critical thought, critical consciousness in some of this. So when you hear that the pyramids were actually built by aliens, for instance, where you could just go on the internet and in 5 minutes find out otherwise that they were built by Egyptians, people are starting to realize that kind of thing sounds racist too, especially when it's not applied to structures in Europe. Or things like chemtrails. So my birth family, I'm adopted, full of pilots, some commercial, some military. Chemtrails are not a thing. They started as a conspiracy theory in a particular show, and if you look on the internet for 5 minutes, you can find it. So stuff like that, right? UFOs and all that. Personally, I'm actually open to the idea of intelligence from other worlds and even perhaps visiting us, but we're not Grand Central Station of the universe, and there's all this conspiracy stuff that tends to go with it. So all of that's part of the shadow of the New Age or New Spirituality or whatever we want to call it. It tends to unconsciously repeat the old dogmatic forms and approaches and creeds without realizing it, which is part of the problem of trying to just dump an old map and use a new one. You tend to bring remnants of the old one with you. So one thing that might help with this is to take some of it less literally. So if you like the idea that your soul actually comes from the Pleiades, even though they're only a constellation from Earth, you might look up the Pleiades because they're in terms of myths from other cultures, because there's really rich stories about them, and they might mean something on that level, more symbolically, more mythologically, rather than literally. So next time, I'm going to talk about one more worldview that's not aging so well. It's probably the newest of all of them. I refer to it as the techno-redemption worldview. And then after that, let's get on to, so what kind of maps do we want? What kind of maps can we build that bring us back a sense of enchantment, that help us live on this planet, this alien planet of ours, help us get along with each other? What can we do in terms of those possibilities?